The first time I saw the Bluefin Diner, it was exactly the kind of place I expected to find in a wasteland like this. Route 66 stretched ahead like a ribbon of asphalt through the barren desert, the air shimmering with heat under the relentless afternoon sun. The road seemed endless, with nothing but barren land and the occasional cactus breaking the monotony. It was the kind of desolation that made you feel small, insignificant, just another speck in the vastness of the universe. I'd been on the move for weeks, drifting from town to town with nothing but my old duffel bag and a sense of hollowness that had settled in my chest like a stone. After losing my job and falling out with the few friends I had, it felt like there was nothing left for me anywhere. The nights were the hardest. Sleepless hours spent staring at motel ceilings, wondering if I would ever find a place where I belonged. I had no family to turn to, and each new town was just another place to pass through, another attempt to escape the emptiness inside. I have no family, no friends, and no place to call home. The kind of person who could disappear without a trace and no one would even notice. It was as if I was a ghost already, drifting aimlessly, waiting for anything to give me a reason to stay. When I pulled into the parking lot, there wasn't a soul in sight. Just a faded sign hanging by a single rusty chain that read, "Help Wanted," and an old gas pump out front that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. The diner itself looked like it had been forgotten by time, the paint peeling, the windows dusty and streaked. It was a relic of a bygone era, a place that seemed to exist out of sheer stubbornness. I paused for a moment, staring at the sign. Maybe this was what I needed. I had nowhere else to go. No direction, just a longing for a place to belong, even if just for a few nights. The thought of having something to do, even if it was just washing dishes or sweeping floors, was enough to make me consider it. I pushed the thought away, taking a deep breath, and made my way inside, the bell above the door chiming softly as I stepped inside. The dim interior was a mix of peeling wallpaper, cracked linoleum floors, and flickering neon lights that cast eerie shadows across the empty booths. The air was thick with the smell of grease and old coffee, a mix that clung to my senses, making my stomach turn slightly. A single man stood behind the counter, his face lined and weathered, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. He was the owner, though he never bothered to tell me his name. I hesitated for a moment before making my way to a booth in the corner. I slid into the cracked vinyl seat, the material sticking to my skin as I settled in. The owner watched me, his expression unreadable, his hollow eyes following my every move as if sizing me up. After a moment, he shuffled over, a notepad in hand. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice gruff, his tone making it clear he wasn't interested in small talk. I glanced at the faded menu lying on the table, the pages yellowed with age and stained with coffee rings. There wasn't much to choose from, and everything looked like it had been there since the place first opened. "Just a coffee, please," I replied, offering a small, tentative smile, though I doubted it would make any difference. He nodded, turning away without a word. I watched as he moved behind the counter, the sound of the coffee machine breaking the silence. It felt strange, almost surreal, sitting there in the empty diner, the hum of the old refrigerator, the only other noise. The neon sign outside flickered, casting brief flashes of red and blue across the room, adding to the sense of unease that seemed to permeate the place. He returned a moment later, setting the chipped mug in front of me. I wrapped my hands around it, savoring the warmth, even if the coffee itself tasted burnt and bitter. It was something tangible, something to hold on to in the unsettling quiet of the diner. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave a curt nod, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer before he turned away, his footsteps echoing across the empty floor as he retreated behind the counter. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, even when his back was turned. I cleared my throat, pointing towards the sign outside. "You hiring?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I intended, the words barely carrying across the empty room. He looked at me for a moment, his gaze weighing on me, then nodded slowly, as if the decision wasn't really his to make, as if he was resigned to whatever fate had brought me here. "Need a job?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth, like he had heard the same request 100 times before and knew how it would end. I nodded. The truth was, I needed money, enough to get me out of this place, to the next town, and maybe a little further. He didn't ask any questions, didn't want to know where I was from or what had brought me here. He just nodded back, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his head, like he understood more than he was letting on. "Okay, you'll start tonight," he muttered, his voice carrying a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Was it pity, or maybe just indifference? He hesitated for a moment, then gestured for me to follow him. "Let me show you around," he said, his voice still gruff, but with a hint of resignation, as if he knew that neither of us had much of a choice in the matter. I got up from the booth, the seat creaking as I stood, and followed him through the diner. He moved slowly, pointing out the essentials with a practiced efficiency, his voice a monotonous drone as he spoke. "The counter where you'll be serving. Coffee machine. Temperamental, but it works if you treat it right. Kitchen's back here," he said, pushing open the swinging door to reveal a grimy room filled with old pots and pans. His words were clipped like he was simply going through the motions. There was a weariness to him, an exhaustion that seemed to seep into every word he spoke. He showed me the storage room, the restrooms, and even the back exit, his explanations brief to the point. There was no warmth in his words, no attempt to make me feel at ease. Just the basics, like he'd done this before, like he knew I wouldn't be here long. After a while, he turned back to the front, pausing by the door. "That's about it. Good luck, kid," he said, his hollow eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. There was something in his gaze, something unsaid, but before I could make sense of it, he grabbed his coat from behind the counter and walked out, the door closing with a jingle of the bell. I watched him disappear into the night, something about the way he'd said those words making my skin prickle. There was an emptiness in the diner now, a void that seemed to expand in his absence. But I ignored it. I needed this. I needed something to keep me grounded, even if it was just for a little while. I walked around the diner, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the cracked vinyl booths, and the flickering neon lights that cast an eerie glow over everything. There was something unsettling about the place, something that felt wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation, the sense of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. I went to the kitchen in the back, a grimy little room filled with pots and pans that had seen better days. The air was thick with the scent of stale grease and something metallic, and I could hear the faint drip of water echoing from a leaking pipe. The floor creaked under my weight, and every surface seemed to carry a layer of grime that spoke of years of neglect. There was a window above the sink, looking out over the parking lot, and beyond that, a lake. It was the only thing that broke the monotony of the desert, a dark, still body of water that seemed to go on forever. I settled in behind the counter, a cup of lukewarm coffee in front of me as I tried to stay awake. The hours dragged on, the silence pressing in on me until I heard it, a soft, haunting melody drifting through the air. At first I thought it might have been the wind, but as the sound grew clearer, I realized it wasn't natural. There was a rhythm to it, an eerie beauty that seemed almost deliberate. It tugged at something inside me, urging me to move, to follow. I frowned, looking around, but there was no one else in the diner. The sound seemed to be coming from outside, from the direction of the lake. I glanced out the window, catching a glimpse of the dark water. The lake lay still, its surface unnaturally smooth, reflecting the pale light of the moon. It looked almost lifeless, an expanse of inky black that seemed to swallow all light and sound. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, a sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite shake. I shook my head, trying to ignore it, but the melody grew louder, more insistent, until I found myself standing up, my feet moving almost as if they had a mind of their own. It was as if the sound was pulling me, dragging me towards the door, and I felt an overwhelming urge to step outside and find its source. I walked to the door, my hand reaching for the handle, when something caught my eye. A crumpled note stuffed inside the lining of one of the cracked vinyl booth seats, the tear just big enough to hide it. The paper was creased, torn at the edges, and in scrawled handwriting it read, "Do not, under any circumstances, go near the lake. If you see wet footprints leading from the lake to the diner, clean them immediately with hot water. If you hear scratching on the windows, keep your eyes on your work. The diner lights must remain dim but never off." I looked back at the door, the melody still calling to me, but I forced myself to step back, to sit down. I couldn't explain it, but something about the note felt true. The note was unsigned, but I felt a chill run down my spine as I read it. The old man hadn't mentioned any of this. As I looked at the stains, the smudges of dark red that could only be blood, I felt something twist inside me, a sense that this wasn't just some elaborate joke. As dawn broke, I saw the owner return, his hollow eyes glancing at me without a word. He looked more tired than before, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than seemed necessary. He didn't ask if I'd heard anything, didn't seem to care how my shift went. I watched him for a moment, wondering what secrets lay behind those tired eyes before returning to my car to try and get some sleep. Exhaustion weighed heavy on me, but sleep was elusive. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed I was drowning in the nearby lake, the dark water wrapping around me, pulling me under while the haunting melody echoed all around, muffled and relentless. I jolted awake, my heart pounding, the fear lingering even as I tried to shake it off. It wasn't much, but it was all I had, a few hours of uneasy rest before the next night began. I found an old, half-stale sandwich that tasted like cardboard and washed it down with a cup of coffee so bitter it almost made me gag. I forced it down anyway, needing the energy. The next night was different. I was wiping down the counter, the old man gone home for the night, leaving me alone in the dimly lit diner. The air was thick, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint buzz of the flickering neon sign outside. It was almost 1 in the morning, and the road outside was empty. Nothing but darkness, stretching into oblivion. The hum of the old refrigerator seemed to grow louder in the quiet, a low, unsettling drone that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I could hear the occasional creak of the building settling, the soft rustle of something brushing against the outside walls, maybe the wind or maybe something else. The air felt colder now, the chill creeping in, making me shiver. I decided to take a break from the unnerving quiet and clean the restrooms. I grabbed a rag and some cleaning supplies and made my way to the back. The restrooms were just as grimy as the rest of the diner, the tiles cracked and stained, the mirror above the sink coated in a layer of grime that made my reflection look ghostly. I scrubbed at the sink and wiped down the counters, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to be pressing in on me. The sound of dripping water echoed off the walls, each drop seeming louder than the last. When I finally finished, I took a deep breath and made my way back to the front of the diner. But as soon as I stepped out of the restroom, my heart froze. There, on the floor, were wet footprints. I dropped the rag I was holding, the sound of it hitting the ground barely registering in my ears. The footprints led from the door, across the diner floor, and toward the counter where I stood. They were elongated, almost human, but not quite, with webbed impressions that suggested something unnatural. My heart pounded as I backed away, my eyes tracing the eerie shape, each step seeming deliberate, as if whatever made them had been searching for me. I remembered the second rule: clean them immediately with hot water. My heart thudded in my chest as I rushed to the back of the diner, my hurried footsteps echoing through the stillness. The sound seemed unnaturally loud, bouncing off the stainless steel counters and the cold tile walls. Grabbing the bucket, I fumbled to turn on the tap, my trembling hands struggling against the stubborn faucet. The water gushed out in a rush, scalding and steaming in the cold air of the kitchen, filling the small space with a thin fog that swirled around me. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I filled the bucket to the brim. My senses sharpened, every creak and groan of the old building amplified by my growing unease. The sensation of being watched prickled at the back of my neck, a phantom presence lurking just out of sight. I shook it off and lifted the bucket, the hot water spilling over the sides and stinging my hands, but the pain barely registered. My focus was on the footprints, those dark, damp impressions that had appeared as if from nowhere, staining the floor and spreading slowly, deliberately. As I hurried back to the front of the diner, the bucket wobbled in my grasp. My nerves betrayed me, and I stumbled. The bucket slipped from my grip, crashing to the floor with a metallic clatter. Hot water splashed everywhere, soaking my shoes and hissing as it hit the tiles. My heart raced, a mixture of panic and dread coursing through me as I scrambled to recover the bucket. My hands stung from the heat, but I didn't care. I had to clean the footprints. Each step left behind by whatever unseen thing had made them was distinct, more defined than before. It was as though the footprints weren't just marks, but a manifestation of something growing stronger, more tangible. They darkened like ink spilled on white paper, their edges crisp and deliberate. Grabbing a rag, I dipped it into the hot water and began scrubbing furiously. The steam rose in curling tendrils, wrapping around me like a ghostly mist. My breath came in shallow gasps, fogging the air. As I worked, a faint sound reached my ears, a hiss, low and menacing, like the quiet escape of steam under pressure. It was followed by whispers, so faint they could have been imagined. But they felt real, too real. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a cacophony of faint voices overlapping, words indistinguishable but their intent clear. I scrubbed harder, the rag slipping in my shaky grip. Slowly, the footprints began to fade, dissolving under the scalding water. Relief should have come with their disappearance, but it didn't. The sense of being watched, of something lingering just out of reach, only grew stronger. My eyes darted toward the windows. The reflection staring back at me was pale, terrified, and wholly unrecognizable as my own. For a moment, I thought I saw something move. A flicker of shadow shifting behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there, nothing but the empty diner, silent and still. When the owner arrived in the morning, I told him everything. My words tumbled out in a rush, the footprints, the whispers, the movement in the reflection. His reaction was unsettling. He listened, but his expression remained cold, detached. His eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, betrayed no emotion. "You're just tired," he said finally, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Working nights can mess with your mind. You start seeing things that aren't there." His dismissive tone stung, but it was the look in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken, something hidden that truly unnerved me. Deep down, I knew he was lying. I nodded anyway, swallowing my unease. I told him I'd finish my shift tonight, but expected to be paid in the morning. He gave me a strange look, his lips curling into a smirk that chilled me to the bone. "Sure, kid," he said. "Tonight will be your last night." The day passed in a haze. Sleep eluded me, my mind replaying the events of the previous night on an endless loop. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the diner in long shadows, I was back on shift. That night, the diner felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker and more pronounced. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the street outside felt amplified. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. Then, without warning, the jukebox crackled to life. Its speakers sputtered and hissed before emitting a distorted tune, a melody warped and alien. The sound filled the diner, jarring and dissonant, scraping against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. I rushed to the machine, frantically pressing buttons in an attempt to silence it, but nothing worked. The music only grew louder, more chaotic, until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. And then I heard it, the scratching. Soft at first, like the tentative touch of nails against glass. It came from the windows, faint but insistent, growing louder with each pass. My stomach tightened, dread pooling in my chest as Rule 3 echoed in my mind. If you hear scratching on the windows, keep your eyes on your work. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the dishes I was drying. My hands moved on autopilot, trembling as I tried to ignore the relentless scraping. It grew more deliberate, more impatient, the sound burrowing into my mind. The jukebox fell silent as suddenly as it had started. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the window. It was tall, its silhouette sharp and menacing, with eyes that gleamed like cold fire. Its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating force that filled the diner with an oppressive energy. I kept my gaze fixed on the counter, refusing to look directly at it, but I could feel its eyes boring into me. The door burst open, and the owner stumbled in, his face pale and lined with fear. "Sorry, kid," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You weren't supposed to make it this far." Before I could ask what he meant, the owner strode toward the window, his steps hesitant yet resolute. My heart sank as I watched him fumble with the latch, his hands trembling. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice breaking with desperation. He turned to me, his face hollow, his expression a twisted mix of guilt and dread. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I had no choice. It's the only way to keep the danger at bay." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. What danger? Who or what was he talking about? The betrayal in his tone was palpable, but the horror behind his actions was even more so. My chest tightened as the implications settled in. I was a pawn, a sacrifice meant to prolong his desperate survival. Before I could react, the latch clicked open. A gust of cold air swept through the diner, carrying with it an oppressive sense of foreboding. The shadow outside began to move, its elongated skeletal fingers curling over the window frame. Its claws scraped against the glass, leaving thin, jagged lines. As it climbed inside, the dim light of the diner revealed its unnerving form. Its body was impossibly thin, its pale, taut skin stretched over angular limbs. Dark, matted hair clung to its face, and its wide, unnerving grin revealed sharp, jagged teeth. But it was its eyes that held me frozen. Sharp, calculating, and brimming with a terrifying awareness. The owner turned to me, his face contorted with a sick mixture of regret and self-preservation. "It won't take long," he muttered, though I couldn't tell if he was trying to reassure me or himself. But I wasn't ready to give up. As the creature's gangly limbs reached toward me, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy skillet from the counter, and swung it with all my strength. The skillet struck with a sickening thud, but the creature barely flinched. Its head snapped back unnaturally before it turned to face me again, its eerie smile unwavering. The owner let out a broken scream as the creature turned its attention to him. It moved with horrifying speed, closing the distance in a single fluid motion. Its clawed hands gripped his shoulders, pulling him toward its gaping maw. "Please, no," he cried, his voice raw with terror. "I did what you wanted." But the creature didn't seem to care. It lashed out, and the owner's cries cut off as it overpowered him. The scene was too much to process, but I forced myself to act. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use. The diner's emergency exit came into view, and I made a split-second decision. I grabbed a bottle of cleaning alcohol from beneath the counter and hurled it at the creature. The bottle shattered against its back, drenching it in the pungent liquid. As it turned toward me, its hollow, unblinking eyes locked onto mine, I pulled a lighter from my pocket. "Stay back!" I shouted, flicking the lighter open and holding the flame in front of me. The creature hesitated, its twisted form shifting as though calculating its next move. Seizing the moment, I tossed the flame toward it. The alcohol ignited instantly, engulfing the creature in a burst of fire. Its scream was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a guttural, otherworldly wail that reverberated through the diner. It thrashed wildly, its limbs flailing as the flames consumed it. The acrid smell of burning filled the air, overwhelming my senses. I didn't wait to see if it would survive. I bolted for the emergency exit, my legs powered by pure adrenaline. The door burst open under my weight, and I stumbled into the cool night air. Outside, the world was eerily silent. The noises from the diner muffled behind me. I didn't look back. My car was parked just a few feet away, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling uncontrollably. When the engine roared to life, I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped away. My chest heaved with each ragged breath, my mind racing with the horrors I had just escaped. As the diner disappeared in my rearview mirror, exhaustion began to settle in, but the unease lingered. I had survived, but I knew the creature, or whatever darkness had spawned it, was far from defeated. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. The shadows seem deeper, the silence heavier, and sometimes late at night I hear faint whispers just beyond the edge of perception. I escaped, but at what cost?